At my cousin's wedding, my chair had no name tag, no plate, and no seat at the family table. When I asked, my aunt said loudly, "You're lucky we even let you come." My uncle added, "You've always been the outsider. Don't make this about you." I didn't respond. I just reached into my bag, took out the backup USB, and walked straight toward the DJ booth. 5 minutes later, the music stopped, and so did every conversation in the room. I, 32M, stood at the entrance of the reception hall, scanning the elegantly decorated tables for my assigned seat. The wedding had been beautiful. My cousin looked radiant, and the ceremony went off without a hitch. But as I walked between the round tables draped in ivory linens, checking each carefully handwritten name card, a familiar knot formed in my stomach. Table after table, I searched. The immediate family sat at the head table, aunts and uncles at the tables closest to the front, cousins and their families scattered throughout the middle section. I recognized faces from childhood gatherings, people I hadn't seen in years, but who still warranted a proper place setting. My footsteps slowed as I reached the back of the room, still searching. Finally, I spotted a chair pushed slightly away from one of the last tables. No name card, no plate, no silverware, just an empty chair that looked like an afterthought. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of 2 decades of family gatherings where I'd been treated like a visitor rather than blood. My aunt approached from behind, her voice cutting through the ambient chatter and clinking glasses. She told me loudly that I was lucky they even let me come. Heads turned at nearby tables, conversations pausing as family members glanced our way. The humiliation burned across my face, but before I could respond, my uncle appeared beside her. He added that I'd always been the outsider and shouldn't make this about me. His words hit like a physical blow, confirming what I'd suspected for years, that despite sharing the same grandmother, despite being invited to every major event, I was considered a burden rather than family. I could have argued. I could have pointed out that I'd driven 4 hours to be there, bought an expensive gift, and arranged time off work. I could have reminded them of the countless times I'd helped during family crises, or how I'd been the only one to visit Great Aunt Martha in the nursing home before she passed. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small USB drive. I'd brought it as a backup of my own photos from the wedding, planning to share them with family later. But as I looked at my aunt's smug expression and my uncle's dismissive sneer, I remembered what else was stored on that drive. I walked directly toward the DJ booth at the front of the room. The young man behind the controls looked up as I approached, probably expecting a song request. I told him I had some special photos from the bride and groom that they wanted shared during the reception. He nodded enthusiastically and took the USB drive, plugging it into his laptop. I returned to my empty chair and waited. Within minutes, the music faded and the large screens around the room flickered to life. Instead of the expected wedding photos, a different kind of slideshow began. The first image showed my uncle's tax documents from 3 years ago, documents I discovered while helping clean out my grandmother's house after her funeral. He'd been claiming her as a dependent for tax benefits while she lived independently, pocketing thousands in fraudulent returns. The second image showed bank statements indicating he'd been writing checks from her account for household expenses that lined up suspiciously with his own credit card payments. But the real bombshell came with the third set of images. These were screenshots of text messages between my aunt and her sister, messages I'd accidentally seen on a family phone that got mixed up during a holiday gathering. In them, she detailed how they'd been systematically convincing other family members that I was ungrateful and entitled, poisoning relationships to ensure I'd be excluded from family decisions about inheritance and property. The room fell completely silent. Guests stared at the screens in shock, while family members began recognizing the implications of what they were seeing. My cousin, the bride, looked mortified. Her new husband seemed confused, probably wondering what kind of family he'd just married into. My uncle's face went pale as he realized what was happening. He started moving toward the DJ booth, but it was too late. The slideshow continued with more evidence. Photos of valuable family heirlooms that were supposed to be distributed equally among grandchildren, but had mysteriously disappeared into my aunt and uncle's house. What happened next was chaos. Family members started talking over each other, demanding explanations. My aunt tried to claim the documents were fabricated, but too many people recognized the handwriting and familiar details. My uncle attempted damage control by saying it was all a misunderstanding, but the bank statements spoke for themselves. The bride finally asked the DJ to stop the slideshow, but the damage was done. Wedding guests were pulling out their phones, some discreetly recording the drama unfolding before them. Social media posts were probably already being composed. I stood up from my empty chair and walked toward the exit. My cousin caught up with me in the parking lot, tears in her eyes as she apologized. She told me she had no idea about the seating arrangement and certainly didn't know about her parents' financial schemes. I assured her that I didn't blame her. This wasn't her fault, and I was sorry her wedding had been disrupted. What I didn't tell her was that I'd been planning this reveal for months. I'd gathered evidence slowly, carefully, waiting for the right moment when the entire family would be together. When I'd been excluded from family meetings about grandmother's estate distribution, I knew exactly what was happening. When invitations to holiday gatherings became sporadic and I was seated at children's tables despite being in my 30s, the pattern became clear. The USB drive had been my insurance policy. I'd hoped I wouldn't need to use it, that maybe family relationships could be repaired through honest conversation. But when I arrived at the wedding and saw that empty chair, when my aunt publicly humiliated me and my uncle confirmed my worst fears about how they viewed me, I knew it was time. Update 1. 3 days after the wedding, my phone started ringing constantly. The first call came from my uncle, alternating between angry threats and desperate pleas to talk things over like family. I let it go to voicemail. His message was a rambling mixture of denials and weak justifications about needing money for medical bills that I knew were lies. My aunt tried a different approach, sending long text messages claiming that I'd misunderstood everything and that the financial documents were taken out of context. She insisted that grandmother had given them permission to manage her accounts, conveniently forgetting that the bank statements clearly showed transactions continuing months after grandmother's death. The most interesting call came from my cousin, the bride. She told me that after I'd left, the reception had essentially ended early. Half the family had stormed out in various states of anger and embarrassment, while others had stayed to demand explanations from my aunt and uncle. The wedding photographer had quietly stopped taking pictures, and several relatives had asked for copies of what they'd seen on the screens. She also revealed something I hadn't expected. Apparently, I wasn't the only family member who'd been systematically excluded and badmouthed. My second cousin, who lived across the country, had also been painted as difficult and ungrateful whenever estate discussions came up. The pattern was becoming clear. My aunt and uncle had been working to isolate anyone who might question their handling of family assets. But the real consequence came a week later. Several family members had contacted lawyers about the financial irregularities they'd witnessed. My grandmother's estate, which everyone thought had been properly settled, was being reviewed for potential fraud. Bank records were being subpoenaed, and my uncle's tax returns were under scrutiny. I received a formal letter from an attorney representing 3 of my cousins, asking if I had additional documentation beyond what I'd shown at the wedding. I did. I had bank statements going back 5 years, email communications between my aunt and uncle discussing how to handle family members who asked too many questions, and even a recording of a conversation where they discussed selling family property without informing other heirs. Update 2. 2 months after the wedding, the full scope of my aunt and uncle's financial manipulation became clear. The attorney hired by my cousins had uncovered systematic theft spanning nearly 7 years. It started small after my grandfather died, little charges here and there from grandmother's account. But after she developed dementia and moved to assisted living, the amounts increased dramatically. They'd been paying themselves a caretaker fee, while grandmother's insurance already covered her actual care. They'd sold her car and kept the money instead of adding it to her estate. Most damaging of all, they'd convinced her to sign documents transferring ownership of the family cabin to them, claiming it was for tax purposes, but never transferring it back. The family cabin was worth nearly $300,000 and was supposed to be divided equally among all grandchildren. Instead, my aunt and uncle had been using it as a vacation rental, pocketing the income while telling everyone it was too expensive to maintain. My uncle hired his own lawyer and tried to claim that everything had been done with grandmother's knowledge and consent. But medical records clearly showed her cognitive decline timeline, and several of the documents in question had been signed after she'd been declared mentally incompetent by her doctors. The fallout extended beyond legal consequences. My aunt's sister, who'd been complicit in the smear campaign against me, found herself ostracized by other family members who'd learned about her role in the deception. Holiday gatherings were canceled because nobody wanted to navigate the awkwardness of choosing sides. My cousin's marriage was suffering too. Her new husband's family had heard about the wedding disaster through social media posts from guests who'd witnessed the slideshow. She'd called me several times, apologizing and begging me to somehow help repair the family's reputation. I felt genuinely bad for her, but there was no putting this particular genie back in its bottle. The most satisfying moment came when I received a call from the family attorney who'd originally handled grandmother's estate. He told me that if I hadn't exposed the financial irregularities, they might have continued for years. Grandmother's assisted living facility had been raising red flags about missing payments, but my aunt and uncle had been giving them just enough money to avoid immediate consequences while skimming the rest. 3 of my cousins reached out to apologize for believing the stories they'd been told about me. They'd been convinced that I was somehow problematic, that my absence from family events was due to my own antisocial tendencies. Learning that I'd been systematically excluded made them reconsider years of family dynamics. Update 3. 6 months later, the legal proceedings were nearing conclusion. My uncle had agreed to a settlement rather than face criminal charges for elder fraud and tax evasion. He was required to pay back approximately $450,000 to grandmother's estate, plus interest and legal fees. The family cabin was being sold, with proceeds divided equally among all grandchildren as originally intended. My aunt faced social consequences that were arguably worse than the legal ones. Most of the extended family had cut contact with her completely. She'd been forced to resign from her position at the local charity board when other members learned about the fraud. Her closest friends in the community had distanced themselves after the story spread through their social circles. The most unexpected development was how the family dynamics shifted in my favor. The cousins who'd apologized weren't just being polite. They genuinely wanted to rebuild relationships. I'd been invited to 2 birthday parties and a graduation celebration, treated not as an outsider, but as someone who'd courageously stood up against injustice. My cousin's marriage had actually survived the drama, though it took several months of counseling. Her husband eventually understood that she'd been as much a victim of her parents' manipulation as anyone else. Their wedding had been ruined, but they'd used the experience to establish firm boundaries with toxic family members from the beginning of their marriage. The USB drive that had started it all was eventually returned to me by the attorney handling the case. I kept copies of everything, of course, but having the original felt symbolic. Such a small device had contained the power to expose years of deception and financial abuse. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if there was a less dramatic way to handle the situation. But every time I consider the alternatives, I remember that empty chair at the wedding reception. I remember my aunt's loud declaration that I was lucky to even be there, and my uncle's confirmation that I'd always be an outsider. They'd made their choice about how to treat family. I'd simply made mine about how to respond. The family gatherings that do happen now are smaller, but more genuine. The people who attend actually want to be there and treat each other with respect. My grandmother's money went to fund college educations and help with medical bills instead of subsidizing my aunt and uncle's lifestyle. And whenever someone new joins the family through marriage or partnership, they hear the story of the wedding slideshow, not as a cautionary tale about revenge, but as a reminder that family doesn't give anyone license to abuse trust or treat others as less than human. The empty chair became a catalyst for accountability, and sometimes that's exactly what a family needs.